Hey, Sally, it's so good to have you on Creative Inspired Happy.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to talk to you.
It's super fun to get to celebrate the release of my next novel 1 year ago in Spain with you because you did some art for it, actual art in the book, but also, of course, your paintings were the inspiration for the work of one of my characters. So I'm really thrilled today that we get to compare careers in the fine art world and writing, and we're both working moms as well. So I feel like we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, sounds fun.
So I don't know much about painting other than the research I did by interviewing you earlier for my book and my character, Matthias, who is also a painter. And basically, I just copied your style of art and your processes for him, except with a little bit of like a super sunshiny sprinkle because he's a very bouncy, sunshiny, optimistic person. So, like the
hmm
little touches that he makes on his paintings, because you are, is it classical realism? Is that the
Yeah.
so he's a classical realist as well, except that, his touches are like little whimsies, basically. But
hmm
I would love to hear about your process. How do you start from idea of a painting until finish? And then how long does that take?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually one that I've also researched in terms of how my predecessors in art have done this in the 19th century, because I wrote a dissertation about how 19th century French academic artists did their whole process, and I got to compare it with my own too, painting in the same tradition. So for me, it really depends on how big a painting is. There are fun little one-off paintings and studies, like I see a cactus, I think it's really cool. I set up a panel, I just paint the cactus as I see it. It's done in a day. It's fun. And those are like observational paintings. I see something in the world, I think that it looks really beautiful, and I capture it. Then there are bigger paintings where I have some concept behind it, or there's a commission and the client has a concept they want like visible, or it's a narrative painting with multi figures, and those take a lot longer. So for those, I usually have the idea, and usually the idea starts with like one element. So I think this pose would be an interesting pose to communicate this idea, and then I work from that. So the first step is always a sketch, usually in graphite on paper, to get like the overall composition, get my ideas down. Once I've done the sketch, I get all of the stuff. And I would say that maybe 50% of painting is just acquiring stuff to look at. So I get all this stuff to like build the little stage of the objects that are going to be in it. Maybe there's a model for it. There's cloth, there's drapery. Then I start doing the drawing. So once my stage is set, I do the drawing, usually at the size I want it to be. Although sometimes I do the drawing and realize, oh no, it needs to be bigger. It needs to be smaller. That's where Kinko's is great. Go to Kinko's, make it bigger, make it smaller.
And
Then I
this
have
is
my,
different from that initial sketch that you did with the graphite.
right. Yeah. Initial sketch, the initial concept sketch is often like they call it a thumbnail sketch in the school that I trained at, because it's tiny and it's really just showing you kind of the abstract composition. Where are the shapes? What's the light and dark? The drawing is more like a roadmap for the rest of the painting. And really, once the drawing is set, I rarely deviate from it at all. Like if I notice there's a problem, it has to be a very serious problem for me to change the drawing. So that drawing is a roadmap. And then I transfer the drawing to the canvas or the panel or whatever I'm going to paint on, and I start painting. And so really from that drawing stage on, I often do a few color studies also on that thumbnail shape before I start painting the final pass.
And a color study is you're choosing like the shades or
Yeah, it's usually it's there's a compositional color study often, which is where I'm kind of seeing how would this all look together in from an aesthetic point of view. Then there's the color study where I'm kind of practicing how do I actually mix these colors for these objects. And so the practice color study is often like bigger. It's like a mini painting of what I'm going to paint, just so that I don't get lost later on in a big painting. So at this point, I've got my compositional sketch, my color studies. I've transferred my drawing to the canvas or panel, and then it's go time. I paint one pass and then I paint a second pass. Usually every day I work on just one piece of it and try to get that as good as it can be before moving on. But the creative part of it pretty much ends once the drawing hits the panel. And from then on, it's just grind, grind, grind to get it out.
And are you just doing like a very small section, like, you know, I don't know, however many inches by inches, like per day, and then kind of like saying, okay, if this is like the first, I don't know, pass or layer, you do this, and then you move up to the next section until you have that kind of layer done, and then you start the next round?
Yeah. So usually I do a whole pass over the whole thing where I get one layer down on everything and I paint pretty loosely. I'm not worried about making it perfect, but just that there's something there for me to look at. But when I'm doing the final pass and really trying to finish it, then every day I'll pick a part. Like I'm going to do the cheek. I'm going to do the nose. And I do that until I think it's as good as it can be. And that's like my work for the day. So
Okay.
yeah. And it's interesting that, I'm not the only one who works this way. There's like, a big tradition of people working this way too, of kind of, we call it window shading because you draw the window down on the painting. So, because often you work kind of top to bottom, so your
Hmm.
hand doesn't smear. So it looks like the painting is kind of coming to life top to bottom.
That makes sense. That was going to be my question because as a writer, a lot of writers we work chronologically in our story, and I was
Mm,
wondering if there's an equivalent in painting. So yeah, that's interesting. And how
yeah.
long does that take? I mean, I guess it depends on the size of the painting, but like
Yeah.
I know
It
I think when
mostly,
we talked, you had thrown out like 500 hours or something for a painting of like average size for you.
yeah, so what's interesting is like over time, how long things take has shortened for me. So my first still life paintings took, like smallish ones like this took 3 or 4 months. And I can do something smallish like this in half the time now, maybe 1 or 2 months, and not even working full time anymore, whereas I was working full time on it before. But for reference, I just completed a 20 by 24, very complicated still life. I started painting it in mid January and I finished it in the end of March. And I was working maybe only 2 or 3 hours a day on it. So that's kind of my speed now, but it's still like it's a long time.
Yeah, yeah. And then like does that include like just the waiting time for everything to dry as well?
No, no, that was like the painting
Hmm.
time. It's, I don't actually need to wait for things to dry with oil painting. I know that's a problem for a lot of other artists, and there's a lot of mediums out there that are like fast drying, slow drying. But for me, because I do this window shading technique and I don't always go top to bottom, I can come to a painting every day and pick the piece that needs to be done where it's, it's as dry or as wet as I want it to be. And I can just do that so that I don't really lose time by waiting. There's always something to be done.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And so I think it's fascinating because I think there are actually a lot of parallels, but some differences between my writing process and your painting. Because, like you, I start with an idea and then I sort of flesh it out into an outline. So I liken this kind of to like your big drawing before, like after the sketch, but the big drawing. However, I stray a lot of times from the outline. And I think that's very different, right? If you're doing a big painting, like you can't change things. But for me, I used to not outline, but it was very dangerous because ideas kind of they spin off on their own and you'll end up writing an entire book and then turn it into your editor and find out that this entire second half didn't work.
Yeah.
And so I learned to outline so that at least it was thought out and I knew where I was going. But there's so much I learn during the process of writing a zero draft or a first draft where I'm getting to know the characters, and something I might have assigned to them in the outline before just doesn't make sense anymore. And so organically it changes, or the story, like, you get to know a character or the plot goes this way, and all of a sudden the story has to veer slightly to the left, whereas it was going straight before. Um, but I
But
think,
it's still really useful, I think. I bet you do this with writing because I do this with painting. If I decide I have to stray, I kind of go back to that drawing stage, and whatever I'm going to fix, I go back to that stage of, okay, here's the drawing and now I'll put it on. And when I was like writing my dissertation, if I had to stray from the outline, I go back to the outline stage for the next
mhm,
thing I'm going to do. And I think there's like a real benefit in separating yourself into two workers. There's the creative worker who sets the task, and then there's the grind worker who gets it done and doesn't second guess the creative worker.
yes, yes.
Because like if you're in the grind stage of I need to get this out and you're questioning every creative decision you made a month ago when you set this up, like you don't go anywhere.
And it also takes so much longer. It's so hard to create and do the actual, like the skill work at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, part of the reason why my process has also gotten faster as well. Plus, I think just
Mm-hmm.
efficiency from experience. But Yeah, so it's like I will, once I finish the zero draft, then it's set-ish, unless I read it and it's terrible, or my editor tells me like this didn't work. But generally nowadays I'm good enough at this. I have like a good enough like intuition about my own plotting and my characters. I mean, 1 year ago in Spain is my ninth published book, right? So it's
Yeah.
like I have like I have absorbed a lot of things that I think were harder at the beginning of my career, and so it is more
Mhm.
efficient. But yeah, I think from like, and this book was really fast. So from idea to like the first draft being done was really just a matter of weeks, which is
Mm.
just absolutely bananas. But usually I would say for me, the process from start to finish is about a year.
Mhm.
And that includes some waiting time. Maybe it's akin to like some painters having to wait for, their
Yeah.
pieces to dry, because I will send a draft into my editor, and then, I'll have to wait for her to like, put it in her queue with her other manuscripts and then get me comments back. But like you said, there's always other things to be working on. There's podcast
Mhm.
interviews to do. There's,
Right.
new book ideas to like write down. So there's always things to be working on. But I would love to talk to you actually about like how your process has gotten more efficient. Like, was there any change that you made consciously, or was it really just an accumulation of expertise?
Part of it's an accumulation of expertise. Like, I think, like you get an intuition for what your characters will be like. And
Mm-hmm.
similarly, I have such an intuition now for like what paint colors I'm going to need to use for this thing. I've often, there are lots of ways in representational art to double check yourself. So, doing measurements on your drawing to make sure it's exactly what you're seeing, or like ways to double check your colors against real life. And now that I've been painting for so many years, I always laugh because like I'll double check myself and I got it right the first time. So like that experience really helps. But I think for me, the biggest thing toward efficiency was having other things on my plate in my life. So like having to do a dissertation, having to be in grad school where I know, okay, I can paint only after dinner. So I have 3 hours, 4 hours, has to be done. And now with a baby, I know I only have these 2 hours. I only have an hour. What can I do? And I think it really has forced me not to kind of stare at the painting and second guess myself and maybe this could be better. Like I just go and make it happen. And then I'll come back later and decide, was that good or not?
Yeah, and actually for me too, it was, I think, Motherhood that was the training to really get my schedule down, because I started writing when my daughter was 1, and so I had babysitting time with the grandparents. That was my
Mhm.
window when I could go to the library and write. And then later it was only when she was in preschool, which, is only like a few hours a day. And so it's like
Yeah.
you really have to be efficient. And then I really, I found that social media can be very distracting. And so now
Mhm.
I have tried to lock down. Like if I am in writing mode, I'll try to set aside a couple of weeks or however much time I think I'm really going to need to completely focus and not be distracted. And I actually delete my social
Mm.
media apps from my phone. And then I re-download them every single time I need to use them. And as soon as I'm done, I delete them again. Cause otherwise I will just constantly keep checking. Cause it's a weakness of mine, unfortunately. Like you
I
can, no
think,
matter how logical you are, it just, for me, that's what happens.
yeah,
But
it's a weakness of everyone, I think.
I mean, it's engineered that way, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you balance now motherhood and having a career in art? Because it takes away a lot of time. And I mean, it's for a good cause. It's
Mhm.
just different. I
Yeah.
think that it's a different phase in life. And now my daughter's a teenager, so I'm well past the infancy stage, but it's a big change.
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, I've been really lucky that this year, her first year of life, we've been here living with my parents so that my mom is the built-in babysitter. So I've been pretty reliably getting, I'll put her down for a nap. She'll nap for an hour. My mom will take her when she gets up. So I can get 2 or 3 hours a day, ever since she was maybe 8 months old. I mean, she was late to the napping schedule. So that's what I've been doing in order to get things done. But I think I basically think you just have to be really kind to yourself and wait for it to happen that you get time. I don't think there's any good way to necessarily balance it. I will say that I like try really hard to do as much as I can with the baby. So like I don't use her naps to fold laundry. We fold laundry together. She loves pulling the laundry out of the basket. It works great. The second she goes down for a nap, like I go do something that I want to do productive.
I think that's a very healthy way to look at it. And I actually remember, so you did a sketch in 1 Year Ago in Spain, and this is an Easter egg for anyone who's read my past books. So I'm not going to say what it is, but if you've read my other books, you'll know it when you see it. But you took a photo of yourself, like doing this sketch while your baby was strapped to you.
Yeah. For the first 6 or 7 months of her life, all of her naps were in like the baby boba wrap. So if she'd fall asleep in the baby boba wrap and I'd like put my paper on an easel and start drawing.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So that probably qualifies as one of the trickiest things you have had to deal with recently with your work. But is there anything else that comes to mind, like on a piece that you've been working on recently that kind of like, I don't know, tripped you up, that was a little bit different than maybe like artistic problems you've had in the past?
Oh, so many. I really feel like the art school I went to, so I went to the Grand Central Atelier in New York City, and they're an amazing school for learning the techniques of realism. But I really came away from that school knowing how to paint anything I put in front of me, but not knowing how to make a whole painting. And so in the years since I've been there, I feel like it's been a whole new education about now, how do I take these pieces that I'm very technically proficient at, but like make it into a compositionally, aesthetically pleasing painting. So, for instance, right before I had my daughter, I did a self-portrait while I was pregnant. And in the first draft of this, the composition was going to be where I included the mirror frame so that it looked like you were seeing it's like a trompe l'oeil, fool the eye of the mirror with me in it. But I made it big. It was almost a life-size portrait. And so when I finished the portrait part because I knew if I gave birth, that was the part I wouldn't be able to paint. Like I could paint the background later. But I finished the background all the way up to that picture frame, the mirror frame. But then when I looked at it and started to put in the mirror frame, something about it being life size, it looked totally wrong. Like I had to completely backtrack and make the background with no mirror frame. And that turned out to be really difficult because the texture of the panel, but where I had painted and not painted, was so different, and I had to like smooth it over. And that kind of like, it turned into a bit of a disaster. I think I maybe pulled it off, but if you look at the painting in person, you can see where this error was with this picture frame. But I'm still at that stage, I think, where I have a vision of what the painting will be, and then when it starts to materialize, it isn't always what the vision was. It doesn't have the same flavor. And I wonder if this is true in writing too, that I feel like my imagination of what my future finished paintings will look like. I'm also doing another portrait right now that has flowers in the background. So I had this vision of what it would be. I did the composition sketch. I was like, okay, I'm going to stick to this. As I'm actually painting it, something about the flavor of it visually isn't what I had imagined. And I feel like my imagination of my future productions is as if it's in someone else's handwriting, someone else's style. And then I get into it myself and it's in my handwriting and my style, and I'm disappointed. So I think the biggest thing that I'm struggling with right now is this tension of either I have to come to terms with what my handwriting, so to say, is, what my style is, what my voice is, and accept it, or I have to actually figure out how to keep myself so on track that I'll get that same outcome at the end, that stylistic outcome that I'm looking for. And I think it's a struggle that I'll probably have for my whole life. But yeah, that's where I am. Is there something similar in writing too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's maybe two different stages, and like you're definitely at the later stage. So like in the beginning, I think with any art, writing or painting or sculpture, etc., there's that gap, right? And I forgot what who termed it. It might have been Ira Glass who like coined that term about that difference between like what you're imagining and then what you're capable of producing. And it takes sometimes years and years of study and practice to like match your vision with something that you can create. But then I think even later on in a career like where you and I are, with writing, you can have an idea of a story. You can be like on the second or third draft of your manuscript and you think you have told the story clearly. And then your editor gets it and then she writes you notes like, well, how does he feel here? And you think, Well, isn't it clear? I mean, he shoved the other guy against the wall. He's pissed. But somehow that execution is missing something, right? So like I know what people are thinking in my book, and then it's not on the page yet. And so I think like
Mhm.
crossing that difference is difficult. And at least in writing, we have an editor who can help us,
Mhm.
to identify, or
Yeah.
oftentimes critique partners, and I feel like with painting, it's a little different because, like you said, once you get to the actual painting stage, you can rarely change anything. Unlike
Yeah.
with a book, I can do multiple revisions kind of over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, like, I really think artists need a community the way writers have been so good about making writing groups for themselves. And it's kind of sad that right now it's really hard in most places in the country that aren't New York City to
Mm-hmm.
find groups of artists to critique your work with each other. And I really loved being at the Grand Central Academy because there were so many good artists around that you could just say, hey, come look at this. Like, what's wrong? And they'd come and tell you what's wrong. But and it's not as typical as writers groups. And I think, going forward in my life, I'm really always going to be looking for an artist's group, a shared studio space. It's really valuable to have another set of eyes on everything.
I can see that. Does it matter what genre, and does it matter if someone is like traditionally trained? Because like, you went to an actual school for this, and me and a lot of other writers I know, I'm self-taught. And so like
Mm-hmm.
I learned from reading books. Like I took one creative writing course much later, after like at continuing education through Stanford, after I had like, learned how to like learn read from like internet sources, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that even though we didn't come from a central school, that we could then still have our own little groups. And maybe it's because, writing is easier to share online. It's much easier to have
Mm-hmm.
virtual friends and communities, like Creative Inspired Happy is a community for writers. And I'm hoping in the future for artists, but I think it's a little harder to translate when you have like a visual medium. And sure, you could, send a digital rendering, but it
Mm-hmm.
lacks the texture and the perspective of like the full piece. And like you said, that self-portrait you did, it was because it was full size, life size, and
Yeah.
that made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there are some relationships among artists where coming from the same technical background is really important, and certain questions for sure. Like, I've gone to so many friends and asked, how do I fix this shadow or whatever? But I actually think there's a huge value to getting, lay opinions on your creative work. So I actually really value when people who say, I don't know anything about art, like tell me what they see, because it is both art, visual art and writing, they're communicative mediums. So if you're not communicating even to the person who doesn't have a background in the same technical skill, that's your fault. So you have to figure out how to do it. And in some cases, people who have that same expertise, we start fooling ourselves because we're so used to kind of the jargon of our field and what's typical in our field. And we're so used to what's typical that we overlook, hey, that white linen cloth around your figure looks kind of like a diaper, right? Because we're so used to seeing classical figures with white linen cloths. And so we'll overlook the fact that to, a normal person, it looks like he's wearing a diaper.
Yeah, that's really funny. So like for with writing, it's actually a little bit difficult, I feel like, to get lay opinions, because for the most part people can only say, well, I don't like it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not as useful for feedback. But I'm rethinking that now that you've mentioned it, because I do see that, in the end, I am writing for readers who are not necessarily writers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can get a little bit in the weeds when we're like, so in the industry and looking just like, okay, on this one scene, I wanted the description to sound beautiful. But maybe from a reading experience, if you have too much description for like several pages, it's just too dense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like higher education kind of makes people afraid to say their opinions about art and writing. Because if you go to college and you major in chemistry, I've just met so many people who say, well, I can't comment on this because I don't know anything. And I have to tell them, no, you do know something. You have eyes. Tell me what you see.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught art history at lab school, high school for several years. And it was always my goal, just every kid in the class, you can tell me what you see. You can tell me your opinions, even if you don't know anything about art. And I think we should encourage that among more people.
Yeah, I agree. I really love that. And I think that it lowers the barriers of entry for everyone as an artist themselves or as someone who can just enjoy art or, books, whatever form of art.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to shift to a kind of a serious question about why I think that women have a hard time asking to be paid for their work. I mean, I think most artists do in general. And at least in the writing world, there is a big burden now put on writers themselves to have to be publicizing. And even if you have a great publisher behind you, they just frankly don't have the resources, the time, or the money to be able to devote to every single book that's going out. And so the burden does come up, part of it on the artist. But
Hmm.
I think that women in particular have a harder time
Hmm.
asking to be compensated for what they deserve in a book that can take a year to write, or a painting that could take basically the equivalent of a year to paint. And
Hmm.
I'm just curious if you feel like you've had that same experience or seen the same among fellow artists, and if you have any theories on why it is or how we can be better.
That's a great question. I feel like most of the artists I know are all really secretive about their prices that they ask for things. So it's actually really hard to get a feel for what are some people asking and not, unless I ask them directly. And I have asked a lot of my friends directly.
But why is it secret? Because that's kind of the same in the publishing industry too. We
Hmm.
don't share, and some people say it's gatekeeping and people are just not being open and we should all be more open. But at the same time, I think there's an element of kindness to it because
Hmm.
the ranges for royalties are so different that
Hmm.
and writers are such sensitive beings that it's really easy for us to fall into the trap of comparing our worth, the value of our art, because like,
Hmm.
oh, well, so and so got paid like, this much and I only got paid this much. And so I think that that's part of the reason why we keep things quiet. And of course,
Yeah.
sometimes there's confidentiality clauses, but I don't know if it's the same in your world.
Yeah, I don't think that there are confidentiality clauses that I've heard of, at least not often in
I guess because you're not
sales.
working with like a big corporation who's a
Right,
publisher.
right. And I really can't speak to the heart of your question about the difference between women and men, but I think that's um, partly because I have so many male friends in art and so many female friends, and I've gotten pretty equal treatment from both of them. So and on the other hand, too, like uh, I've worked with female art representatives to sell my paintings and with male, and I've gotten pretty equal treatment, but I'm not sure that it's representative of what's going on in the field in terms of the gender dynamic. But in terms of like why people keep things secret, I think it's a really good question, and it's probably something we should work to break down in the field. I've asked my friends. I recently sold a painting and I had to name the price because the artist usually names the price and then the gallery or the buyer says yes or no. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of how it works. Which is very frustrating. I would very much like galleries to say, I think this is about this much. What do you think? Can we sell it for that? Because otherwise I'm just like, I don't know what it's worth. So I asked a bunch of my friends and for this one particular painting, and I said, here's the size, here's roughly the complexity, how long it took me, what would you charge? I got a range from 6,000 to 20,000 among artists who I consider pretty comparable. And I don't think that that's good. I mean, I think we should be talking to each other more because we should be going to galleries and clients and saying roughly similar prices. And I think part of the problem is that, and this is different, maybe it's similar to writing. You're not only selling the piece, you're selling your brand of yourself. And the brand of you is the collectible commodity, not the piece necessarily. And so you have to kind of judge where you are on this trajectory. If you name a price too high, you're saying, I'm already super famous and collectible and you should want to own me. If you name a price too low, you're saying, I'm not worth anything. But something in the middle indicates like, I'm going to produce more. I'm committed to this career. I'll be collectible. You should collect me in the future. So there's so much signaling going on with the price that's not about the piece itself. It's actually about you and who you are. And I think that's why people have this tendency to try to keep it private because they don't want to say to you, I'm charging $20,000 because that's the same as saying like, I think I'm really important and people should collect my work. And, also they don't want to say, I actually only charged 6,000 for that one because it's the same as saying, my work isn't selling very well. This is kind of the bottom, this is what I can get it out for. But I think more transparency among friends in the arts would be really helpful to everyone.
I think that's a great point. I had not thought about like the brand of the artist or the writer as
Mm-hmm.
being part of that equation. It's a little bit different in the writing world. Like, yes, we have brands, but also we don't get to set the price, right? We write a book
Mm-hmm.
and then we send it in, our agents send it in, and the agent does the negotiating. And so I think part of it is how good your agent is as well. Like, how
Mm-hmm.
much are they willing to push? You know, I have friends in the past who've had agents who've been very just happy to take whatever offers, and you know, and maybe it was a realistic assessment of where this author's brand, you know, or their book was in the marketplace. Like, maybe there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these kinds of books, and so therefore like it's harder to make that sale. But also sometimes maybe it's like, you know, the agent didn't push hard enough, right? Didn't have enough
Yeah.
to, wasn't able to say like, I think my client deserves a little bit more. So I think it's a little bit tricky, but also
Mm-hmm.
especially with art, maybe even more so than writing. I hate to say that art is artsier than writing, but there's a certain like, you can't put a price on, I don't know, the spirit of a painting. There's like
Mm-hmm.
something, it's not a commodity, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
whereas maybe a brand sort of is, like the art itself, like each work is so different. And I do think that's true with writing, but you know, we have a little bit more fixed, like this is the formula for like this kind of book, or like this is a genre. And like, of course there's, you know, literary fiction, there's always exceptions, you know, that break those rules. But I think it'd be very hard to price
Yeah.
paintings.
Well, I think that this is part of the reason that if you get an MFA, which I don't have, but I have many friends who do, one of the first things they kind of try to make you do is brand yourself with a genre where it means that each painting isn't that different. You become the person who does X thing. And I think part of that is so that you can sort of establish a price for these things. Like, you're the person who does the splatter paintings that look like dogs or whatever it is. And I think this is another thing of why it's hard to price art and why I've had such a difficulty. Is like, I haven't settled on a thing. Everything that I paint is totally different, which makes it really hard to price. But within the representational art world, since we're painting flowers and landscapes and portraits and still lives, there are kind of these subcategories where we can say, this is a flower painting of this size, it should be in this price range. And I think that's similar to books. So the representational art world, I think, is slightly different from the modern art world in that like you can say, this is a romance novel aimed at this audience of this length. You kind of know what category it is. A lot of what we're doing is more easily categorizable like that.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I have one last like big question, and then we'll do like lightning round, kind of quick fire questions, and you get to ask me one at the end as well.
Sure.
Okay, so one lesson that you've learned from your career that you would share with or give advice to for an aspiring artist who's just starting out or is kind of earlier on in their career.
Have other interests other than art and other pursuits, because art is about communicating the human experience, not to sound like cliche, but it is. And if you don't have human experience, you're not going to have any art to make. So have another job, have another hobby, have another interest. It's the most important thing. Have another passion as well as your art.
No, I love that. I love that so much because I was asked recently, you know, how so 1 year ago in Spain happened because I was supposed to be writing a different book. I'd signed a book deal for a book called Whimsy, and that one just I couldn't make it work. There was just something wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my editor if I could quit and if I could write something new. And when she said yes, that's when this idea for 1 year ago in Spain came. And so someone asked me why I thought that happened when I quit the other book. And I think it's because, generally speaking, I like to work on just one book at a time because I only have so much life experience that I've accumulated since the last book that I wrote
Right.
to put into it. You know, like if I want the characters to be meaningful, if I want their backgrounds and their stories to be anything more than just a shallow sketch, a caricature,
Mm-hmm.
I need to be pouring myself into it. So I really love that. The other reason I love what you said, though, is because I think that a lot of writers, they cling to being a writer as their sole identity. And I made that
Mm-hmm.
mistake very early in my career because that's like the dream. It was the thing I wanted the most of all, you know, was to someday make it as a published writer. And so all of my friends were writers. Like everything I read was writing. I was only online talking to writers. And the danger of that is that if you don't make it as quickly as you want to, it feels like a complete failure of yourself. Whereas you should really be able to, remember that you are a whole person with value, in other
Yeah.
aspects of your life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so some quick fire questions for you. Do you listen to music when you work?
No. Too distracting. I think I have too much of an emotional reaction to music.
I also do not listen to music. I can't, I think like the other people's words get in my head and it intertwines with what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Okay, what is one thing that you have to have before you start painting? Like a session for painting. Let's say you're in like the technical get it done grind stage.
Nothing. I can start at any time. But I think that
Really?
this is my brain. This was also true for my PhD dissertation. If I had 10 minutes and I was going from one thing to the other, like I can sit down and get something done. I don't have any
Wow.
prep to do. Yeah.
Okay, that's impressive. I have to kind of like sit down at my desk and then click around, like make sure nothing new happened in the news in the last 5 minutes. And then once I'm sure the world is like, relatively stable for that like 5 minute period, then I can be like, okay, now I can maybe try to write.
I think that's more normal.
Okay, do you have a favorite painting ever that you've made?
That I have made. Oh, I thought you meant
Yes.
from other people. I was going to
Okay, well
plug.
that'll be the next question then.
Okay. It changes every time. I have to say, I hate every painting that I make after it's done. I have to put it away. I come back to it several years later and I think, oh, this is good. so, right now I've actually been reappreciating a still life that I painted in 2022 called Materia Medica. And when I painted it, I thought, this looks awkward. It's too dark. Ugh, put it away. But now I took it out again and I think, oh, this is pretty good.
I like that. I like that. I actually never read my books for the most part
Mm,
after they're published, and part of that's just because I've spent so much time with them
yeah.
already that I just don't need to read it ever again. It also
Yeah.
means that I forget what's in the books because through multiple revisions, you don't remember quite what got thrown out and what got like put back in at different stages. So I use my daughter as my reference because she's read all of my books and she has
Mhm.
an incredible memory, and of course she hasn't read all the previous drafts, right? So I'll be like, hey,
Right.
what happened in this book, and she'll tell me. So
How
that's a lot of
useful.
fun.
What
Yeah,
a
so
useful
what,
employee.
I know, right? Unpaid labor.
Right.
Don't tell her she could be paid. And what is your favorite painting that someone else has done?
Probably Joan of Arc by Jules Bastien Lepage. It's in the Met Museum. It's a huge painting of Joan of Arc looking into the distance. It's amazing because the figure is really very realistically rendered in the academic style, but he uses almost an early impressionist technique for all of the background going around her. So you kind of see what she's seeing as she's having the vision, as opposed to you being a third person seeing the scene.
Oh, okay. Well, I will have to check that out because I do not know that painting. Okay, do you have a question for me?
Yeah. So you have a law degree and were a lawyer before you were a writer. Do you think that that period of your life informs your creative work at all now? Either how you work or just how your brain works?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think it does in a lot of unexpected ways. The most obvious way is that, so I was a corporate lawyer and I worked in long contracts, like contracts that were, sometimes 100 something pages long, very
Mm,
intricate. You had to be very organized. And so I think it does help me think very logically about the structures of my books. Um, the work ethic, like the discipline, if you've ever heard of anyone who's worked in a big international law firm, like the main character Claire actually in One Year Ago in
mm.
Spain, the hours are just insane. You show up at the office at like 8:30. You don't know what time you're going to go home. It could be 6 o'clock. It could be 9 p.m. It could be you're still there the next morning at 8:30 in the morning. Um,
Wow.
but and you also have to bill your time in 6 minute increments because for some reason they decided that you should bill in point one, like tenths of an hour. So it's every 6 minutes you're logging. So your brain is constantly thinking about productivity. And I think that even though I hated being a lawyer, I went because I was a Russian literature and history major and I didn't want to be a professor and I didn't want to work at the CIA, which is the only place where I had a job offer. So I went to law school because they take liberal arts majors, right, who don't know what they want to do with their lives. And that's why there's so many lawyers or so many writers that were former lawyers because we all ended up there for a reason and didn't like it. And that's not to say that law is bad. Like there's plenty of people who are well suited for it. It was not where I belong. So I think that having that kind of discipline is something that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have a really demanding office job or that kind of structure as a young adult with having a first job. If I had gone into writing just straight away, you have to be able to keep your own schedule. And there's no one, especially when you're starting out and you don't have a contract yet and there's no deadlines, there's no one that's going to make that book get done other than you. So I do think it helps in that way. And it also makes me really appreciate my career now, because I didn't want to be a lawyer. And so like, this is so much better. There are always ups and downs to any creative career, but I would not trade it for anything, even the steady salary, the predictability of income from being a lawyer. I still prefer this.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. So before we go, where can people get in contact with you if they're interested in buying any of your work, seeing an online portfolio if you have one, or requesting commissions?
Yeah, so the first place to start is my website, which is just my name, sallyfamacochrane.com. You can also find me on Instagram with the same handle, Sally Fama Cochrane, and email me to talk about paintings, and that's cochrane.sally@gmail.com.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so much fun, and I love getting to get inside your brain and how an artist thinks.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice of you.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.